Hayom Harat Olam. Today, the world was created. Each year on Rosh Hashanah, we celebrate the birthday of the world anew. And just like we might reminisce with our children about the day of their birth, or perhaps other family members might still even reminisce with us, today we can look back at Bereshit, at the beginning of Genesis, to mine more out of a treasured story about who we are and how we got here. As the Torah tells it, at each stage of creation, God saw that it was good, tov. The light was good, the earth was good, the creatures of the air, sea, and land were good. And then God created the human being, and it was good. Actually, the Torah says, tov me'od, it was very good. But what is the first thing that's described in the Torah as lo tov, not good? Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. Vayomer Adonai Elohim lo tov heyot ha'adam levado. Eternal God said, it is not good for the human being to be alone. The Torah is saying that it's not good for human beings to be lonely. Just to be clear, being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Enjoying an afternoon alone, reading a mystery novel, my personal favorite, writing in a journal, going for a hike, or planting flowers in the backyard, all things we might do alone. These are pleasurable and meaningful activities, and they bring us satisfaction, the opposite of loneliness. Loneliness happens when we feel disconnected from other people. It can happen when we're physically alone, grieving the loss of a spouse from death or divorce, the loss of a friend or someone else dear. It can happen when we feel like we have not been able to find someone we want to share our lives with, or when we have a loving spouse but feel like we have too few friends or are living without a larger sense of purpose. And it can happen and perhaps be felt most painfully when we are with other people, even those we love very much and who love us, but somehow we don't feel seen, known, or appreciated. There's tremendous shame and stigma attached to being lonely. Some of us carry this caricature of loneliness in our heads. It looks like someone sitting by him or herself, head down in a dejected posture while a party is going on in the next frame. Being lonely somehow means you're a social reject. But actually, as we just stated, in Bereshit we read that loneliness is woven into the fabric of creation. It's a fundamental part of the human experience. Not an enjoyable one, maybe, but one that almost everyone has at some point or another, and one that we can learn from. And sometimes, but not always, the message it sends us is really simple. Reach out and connect with someone. We are hardwired to be social creatures. When we're hungry, we look for food. When we're tired, we sleep. When we are lonely, our bodies produce oxytocin and we look for connection. The problem comes when loneliness, like other forms of deprivation, is a chronic condition. And today, we have a problem. Loneliness in the United States was recorded as an epidemic before there was a COVID-19 pandemic. In a 2018 study, at least 20% of Americans reported being chronically lonely. And this isn't just an issue of mental health causing depression or anger or substance abuse, all of which are often expressions of loneliness. It's also an issue of physical health. The statistics are staggering. According to Dr. Vivek Murthy, former Surgeon General of the United States, being chronically lonely diminishes life expectancy at the same rate as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And now we add in the fact that we can't gather for most recreational activities or communal activities, we can't travel to see our loved ones, and we have physical, if not social, isolation as a pronounced feature of everyday life. One of the most poignant stories I heard recently was from someone who works as a physical therapist. She said that once or twice a day, when she puts her hands on someone to work with them, they immediately burst into tears. They've suffered from the lack of physical contact for too long. We all know that at this time, in order to be safe, we have to be physically separated from one another. But as various journalists have pointed out, perhaps one silver lining in this pandemic is that it's requiring us to face the places where our society has broken down. And so now we can finally call attention to the problem of chronic loneliness that's plaguing our country. And as I have said, I hope that one of the outcomes of this pandemic is that when it's safe to reconvene, we will come to appreciate our opportunities to be in community so much more. When my kids talk about missing things, camp, friends, and school, I try to remind them to take note of how precious those everyday experiences are, and that they will need to remember not to take them for granted when we get them back. I have to admit, I did also exploit the moment and tell them when it's time to come back to the temple building, I don't want to hear one more complaint about going to Hebrew school or Sunday school. So what can we do? We know that one partial solution to address our loneliness and that of others is technology. At least we have social media and Zoom. And while Zoom can work a good portion of the time for educational purposes, the jury is out on whether Zoom or social media actually help us feel less lonely. Scrolling through social media feeds can easily make us feel more lonely and left out, as well as keep us from actually relating to the people sitting across from us at the dinner table if we're lucky enough to have them. This was part of the pre-pandemic problem and shows up in the fact that there's a higher rate of loneliness among millennials than any other generation. And Zoom, while a wonderful way to connect with people from far away, we know it just has its limitations. Rather than fostering a sense of connection, it can in some ways just give us a taste of what we had before, enough of a taste of what we had before to remind us of everything that we are missing. I know there's some folks in our congregation who just couldn't bear to join us for Zoomed high holiday services. It's what we have for now, but I know it's not really satisfying in the same way. Like I said to the kids, remember that when you are deciding whether or not to take off work to come to Rosh Hashanah services a year from now, please God, may we be in person. And as some of you have heard me note before, one of the strangest features of these Zoom services is the fact that in order to coordinate our ability to sing together, we basically have to sing alone. We hear our own voices with all their flaws, all their off-key moments, all our own difficulties with the Hebrew louder than we hear the voices of anyone else. And this raises one of what I think is the real ways to combat loneliness, to learn to be our own companion. Those of us who are extroverts need to work harder to fill our own cups and become more self-sufficient. We are the least lonely when we can come back to ourselves, feel our grief, whatever it may be, know what is in the depths of our own souls, and try to fulfill our own needs the best we can. We have to cultivate love for ourselves. In the Midrash, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi taught that each of us has a choir of angels that process before us, proclaiming, "Make way for the image of God, make way for the image of God." What if we were actually able to remind ourselves of that every day? Another way of combating loneliness is to deepen our spiritual lives. Rabbi Nachman taught the practice of going out alone into the woods and speaking directly aloud to God. He called it hitbodedut, aloneness. It's awkward at first, but it can be a very powerful, meaningful spiritual experience. I urge you to try it if you never have. And our tradition even teaches that we are not the only ones who get lonely. Even God gets lonely. A Hasidic story as retold by Martin Buber. Rabbi Baruch's grandson, Yechiel, came running into his study in tears. Yechiel, why are you crying?" asked his grandfather. His sobbing grandson explained, "I was playing hide and seek with my friend, but he stopped looking for me and left me alone." Rabbi Baruch caressed Yechiel's face, and with tears welling up in his eyes, he whispered softly, "God too, Yechiel, God is weeping, for God too has been hidden with no one looking for God." As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, God is in search of man. It is a fundamental teaching of Jewish theology that God needs us as partners in creation to repair the world. There's a beautiful retelling of the story of creation by James Weldon Johnson that I can't resist sharing with you. I'm not going to share the whole poem, but parts. "And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, 'I'm lonely. I'll make me a world.' And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other, and God said, 'That's good. Then God raised his arm and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land. And he said, bring forth, bring forth. And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. Then God walked around, and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun, he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things, and God said, I'm lonely still. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river, he sat down with his head in his hands. God thought and thought till he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river he kneeled him down. And there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mommy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he blew the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Amen. God created the world to address God's loneliness. God needs us. It also helps to combat loneliness to know that other human beings, not just God, have shared our experiences of suffering, either now or in the past. That can be true for something as intense as the death of a child, or something as simple as, I had to wait forever in that grocery store line because they were only letting in a few people at the time. I can't tell you how comforting it has been to talk to other rabbis and read posts about them struggling to learn the ins and outs of technology and the film production skills necessary to transfer to online high holiday services. Our biblical and rabbinic texts can give us that experience too. Our matriarchs, Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah, suffered terribly from infertility, for example. And there's a reason that we're instructed to read Psalms in times of distress. They remind us of the universal nature of our emotional experiences, and especially the feeling of loneliness and abandonment. I sometimes turn to Psalm 42. I will say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? And then perhaps the obvious way to combat loneliness, reach out to another person. Those of us who are introverts also have to push out of our comfort zones as well. If technology isn't your thing, just pick up the phone and call someone, anyone, a family member, a friend, an acquaintance. And the other, perhaps more difficult thing is to be the recipient of someone else's attempt to reach out to you. We can help assuage someone else's loneliness as well when we give that other person the opportunity to have a purpose in helping us. I want to say it straight. If you are suffering from loneliness, our community is here for you. All you have to do is pick up the phone and call me, call Sharon, call our board members, and we and members of our tremendous mitzvah corps will call you periodically as well. We certainly can't alleviate all of each other's feelings of loneliness, but we can help some. And if we're willing to break down the walls between us, reveal a bit of our own vulnerability, and push past the stigma of loneliness, we really can enjoy the benefits of true community. I know from many, many conversations with you all over this past year, we really do care about each other's well-being, even if we don't have personal relationships to one another. And it's never too late to build those relationships in any case. Our community is small enough to reach out to everyone, and our synagogue is a precious resource. Please take advantage of it in this difficult time. Another Hasidic story, the beloved master Rabbi Chaim of Tzantz once told this parable. Once it happened that a man became lost in the depths of a dark forest for many days. At long last, he saw another man approaching him. Please, he called out to him, show me the way out of the forest. My friend, replied the other, I too am lost, but I can tell you this, the way I have come from leads nowhere. Let us join hands and search for a new way together. Today's world, and especially this year, have felt to many of us like a dark forest. Don't try to traverse it alone, even while you're at least 6 feet away from each other, wearing masks and praying on Rosh Hashanah over Zoom. I want to conclude by sharing a prayer from Sidur Mishkan Tefillah based upon a famous teaching of Rav Kook. There is one who sings the song of his own life, finding everything within himself. There is one who leaves the circle of herself and sings the song of her people. There is one whose voice rings with the song of humanity, hoping for the highest perfection. And there is one whose voice rises even higher, uniting with all creatures, with all worlds, filling the universe with song. And to continue in Rav Kook's own words, the song of the soul, the song of the nation, the song of humanity, the song of the world, they all mix together within this person at every moment and at all times. And this simplicity in its fullness rises to become a song of holiness, the song of God. This Rosh Hashanah, as we hear our own voices in prayer, may we find fulfillment in the song of our own souls, unite with our people, unite with humanity, unite with the earth, and experience the holiness present in all creation. L'shana tova tikatevu v'techatemu, may we all be inscribed in the book of life for a happy new year.